What we're going to try to do today, what I'm going to try to do is try to contextualize not just the book for this week, which is Joy James's book, Transcending the Talented Tenth, but also to give enough contextualization and linkage so that you can go straight through with the films tomorrow, because there's just no way that I could see. Could somebody pass? Where's Eric? There's just no way I could see doing this week without having two films. And I'm going to describe them in just a minute. And that's 3 full hours. So if you could sort of plan to bring your lunch or something, and we'll do something we're not supposed to do, which is crawl it over 1 o'clock, maybe 15 to 20 minutes, so that there'll at least be some kind of discussion. It won't be an emotionally heavy thing where you sort of sit there numbed, like other films I am sort of famous for showing to students, but rather there may be questions that you have that will help the following day's discussion of the readings, the synthesis seminar. So if people could sort of plan on bringing food to snack through the movies or whatever so that they can hold out for lunch, that would be really great, okay? Now, what are those two films, and why are they important in terms of this week's lecture, which is covering the whole question of Black feminism and the class struggle within the African American community, or I am no longer saying African American, I have to say Black. And I'm going to talk about that for a reason. I just came from a conference in Chicago, which is so totally relevant to this book that I have to talk about, what happened at that conference. And one of the things that happened is, there were several battles that were interesting, and one of them is that there's a narrowness to African American to mean exclusively those people descended of slaves in this country, that with all of these new immigrants coming, that Black is more inclusive. And I thought that was a kind of an interesting commentary in response to a critique I had raised about the lack of an international focus. So, Black it is. And we're going to be talking about the emerging battle between nationalism and the Du Boisian paradigm of the talented tenth, which by this time you understand fully well, the concept of the talented tenth, and the limitations of the struggle for equal access. Now, I want to say that even though we will be talking about that, the limitations of the struggle for equal access, that's going to come up again in week 10 when we look at the chapter that I wrote in this book, Third World Women in the Politics of Feminism, because the chapter goes into the whole issue of cultural nationalism and cultural feminism and the limits of a struggle for equal access to the system. So, we have two films this week. One, which is mentioned in your last chapter of the book, Black Intellectuals in the Age of Crack. We're going to be seeing that, and that's 2 hours. And then we're going to be seeing the film that was on Frontline or PBS around a month ago about Henry Louis Gates and his vision about the talented tenth. So I think it's really interesting that we have those two films to go along with this book, and that's why I decided I couldn't really choose, and that we're just going to have to go through three whole hours. Okay. Now, Let me start out by saying that I had heard about the Boston Magazine on the news, on NPR, National Public Radio. They had this huge article about Boston Magazine's lead article. I didn't even know it was a Boston Magazine, called Head Negro in Charge. It was, that phrase comes from, according to some, the whole notion of the black overseer of other blacks on a plantation, and that presumably comes from slavery, and that the real phrase was head nigger in charge. In the African American community, the black community, it was often just HNIC, right? And it was a joke. I mean, when I grew up, it was a joke. Someone thought he was the HNIC. Everyone knew what that meant. And it wasn't a particularly controversial phrase. However, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago in Boston, April 1998 issue of Boston comes out, there's this article called Head Negro in Charge about Henry Louis Gates, talking about how he is basically positioned to be the person representing the black community, and the black community was all up in arms, and that there were demonstrations and counter-demonstrations in front of Boston Magazine over the offensiveness of this on the cover, this article given, and the title of the article, given the history about it, and so on. So I proceeded to ask my daughter, who's going to law school in Boston, you've got to go to a stand, get me this magazine right away. I've got to have it for this meeting that I'm going to in Chicago, because a lot of the, I think it's going to reproduce some of the issues in this film and this debate that is emerging in the African American community over which direction it should go, and so on and so forth. So she sends it to me overnight. The overnight people get it lost. I have to get this plane Friday. I am dying, right? So finally, I scream and holler, jump up and down to the post office. They have lost it, but they find it. Just before I'm getting ready to take the plane, I dash to the post office, get it, and I read it over on the trip. It's a very long article. And I make a mistake of telling somebody at this meeting in Chicago at the Feminist caucus that I have it with me in my briefcase. Anyway, it was passed around amongst all these 12 people, and I know they did it by accident, but someone took my Boston article that I was going to refer to. So this morning, I called and left a message, and I talked to the woman, and I asked her, please, for the lecture, I need to have it this morning. Would you please fax me the article rather than waiting for me to send my $5, for this Boston magazine? And I really wanted the man. She did. That's what I went upstairs to get the fax. I really wanted the whole magazine, because now, having seen the magazine, it reminds me of something else with Henry Louis Gates. The magazine is, how do I describe it? It is not just like a Seattle magazine, right? Which just is about Seattle. But it's kind of really vapid. I mean, it has absolutely nothing, where to go for massage parlor things. And it does have the weekly stuff, what is happening every month or this month in Boston. But why such a dense article about these issues of the talented test and so on, the debate? How did he get, what does that mean that that article was in that magazine? I'm trying to think, it's not even Gentleman's Quarterly. I'm trying to think as an equivalent. It would be as though it were in Martha Stewart's Living. You know what I'm saying? Let's say something like Seattle Living or In Style, and you've got this article in Martha Stewart's whatever, you know. Wow, 19 pages of this dense debate on black, on which way the black American communities in this country. And I just found it amazing that once I saw the magazine in real life, it does give reason to understand then the conflict in the Boston black community that, and I have to describe the cover, which sort of had one of those town and country type blonde women, who lives in Boston, fabulous, and then they had one side of the, what are the articles going to be, why Boston is considered one of the, which parts of Boston are the chic places to live, where you should invest. And then here underneath, right by her sofa, where she's sort of lounging, is this head Negro in charge, right? All right. So it really is interesting. It's interesting, and I feel that the James book, rather than West, Gates would have been better because for her to use in one of her chapters about the struggle of the black intellectual, for whom do I write? For whom is my intellectual production, and why? That's part of a very important question that she's raising here. And that was one of the and this article talks about the conference, which we will see a video about, that she also talked about in the last chapter. And when I get to that part, I'll talk about it. So I think that the whole question, to start out, about the importance of this book, which I confess I selected. I didn't know about when I selected it, because I wanted the other book that she had written on the struggle, the confrontation of the state, resistance, race, gender, resistance, and the state. Something like that. I can't remember the exact title of that book. But in any event, that was the one that I thought would be very interesting by James, especially because I had found out this was the same Joy James that I knew like a long time ago, because we worked in the same Women for Racial and Economic Equality, which was an activist women's group on the left in New York City. And so she was always kind of quiet. So I just, Joy James, that I'd been reading these articles in books. I just never thought it was the same one until I went to the Critical Race Theory Law Conference and saw her, and we hugged. I said, are you by any chance Joy? Are those your things? And she said, yes, they were. And she said, when I told her that I was teaching this course, she said, oh no, then you should get Transcending the Talented Tenth. And because this issue of the Talented Tenth was people were beginning to see that it was coming back, that we've always said that the Du Bois, Booker T. Washington struggle had never been resolved, ever, and that it looked throughout the 20th century to divide black Americans. But because I immediately said, oh, that title, is there anything about feminism? And then she said, it's all through there. It's central. Trust me, it'll fit with your course. And so that's how I got it. And I'm just so pleased, because this is just one of the most important books, I think, that, in terms of looking at this crisis over the talented tenth that is emerging in the African American community. And what's especially important, I think, this whole issue of the Du Bois life writ large. I mean, he died, in his 80s or something, and he had a very complicated life. And Ida B. Wells, of course, was his one of his allies, and we saw some of the issue in last week's film, A Passion for Justice, right? You could see this Booker T. Washington, Du Bois struggle beginning at the turn of the century. So, the issue then is, in a sense, class, and how it is reflected in the problem of gender and race. So the context of Black Reconstruction and you'll come back to that when you read Ida B. Wells actually, because she gives one of the earliest class analyses, even as she herself reproduces the problem of class. And that's the thing, remember that wonderful Marxist thing, the burden of the past that comes to sit on the shoulders of the living. Even as, and I'm paraphrasing, it's not exactly Marx, but even as people try to supersede what went before, they sometimes reproduce it, which is why we shouldn't ever expect books to be perfect. We should always assume they can be improved, if only updated, with all of the new ideas that have been that come out in a person's life. So this Black Reconstruction period and the activists that emerge in the latter part of the 19th century, in this case, Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, on one hand, they, without a doubt, I mean, so soon after slavery, this is the elite of the Black community. But they also provide the beginning class analysis. And I have to tell you this business about the Republican Party, because your book mentions the Republican Party. It is as a result of Abraham Lincoln being one of the principal people in the Republican Party that you have to see the Republican Party as something that garners the allegiance of Black people at the latter part of the 19th century to stay there until 1936. Okay? That is, Black people voted with the Republican Party until 1936, when Roosevelt wins election. With Roosevelt and his commitment to working people and all of those, New Deal policies, then blacks feel that there's a change in their commitment to electoral politics needed. Okay, you see that? So your reading doesn't really go into that because, if you don't know that, you think of the Republican Party today and it becomes very confusing. Because the Republican Party today is very anti-egalitarian, very conservative. It's reviving these notions of states' rights and all of the pro-slavery arguments in very sneaky, shifty little ways and packaged within the whole kind of colorblind ideology, which is a kind of way of bringing forward into the 21st century the kind of denial of slavery that begins in the 19th century, where you sort of, or what Reconstruction meant and so on. So, both Du Bois and both Ida B. Wells at the turn of the century write two of the most important class analyses of the Black community. One, I think Du Bois writes the first most important class analyses of the United States. Okay. He writes it in 1935. He calls it Black Reconstruction. And we've talked about that before. But he's talking about, and I recommend you go to the library and look it up, and look just at his index. What he's talking about is he sees, or let me put it this way, he sees the Civil War and the struggle that blacks took to the beginning of the Civil War, the struggle against slavery, as the first major labor movement in the United States. Du Bois, in his book Black Reconstruction, his analysis gives the first major labor analysis of the United States by calling the struggle against slavery as the first major labor struggle in this country. It's not the blue boys and the gray boys fighting together in pretty uniforms. No. It is not just states' rights, which is kind of like an anti-federalist position brought to the latter part of the 19th century. No. It is also the first major labor struggle in the United States. Unrecognized as such, true, but that's what it is. Okay? Ida B. Wells, in her Southern Horrors, that she writes actually, I think, before Black Reconstruction, she's the one who gives, I think, and in this, I hadn't really thought of it this way, but I think this is one of the things that Joy James is implying, that because of gender bias, the under-recognition of Ida B. Wells' pioneering work limits then the way people have positioned her and her contribution. And because she starts out in 1892, when those men are lynched, when she starts doing this analysis of lynching, getting all of the data, and then coming to the conclusion that it is economic power that is driving the lynching, she gives what is really the clue about the role of economics in driving racial issues, that then Du Bois takes further. Okay? She gives the first that Du Bois takes further with Black Reconstruction. So in Southern Horrors, which you're going to read in a couple of weeks, you have to see Ida B. Wells' work and her documentation on what was behind lynching and her finding, and she didn't take this hypothesis to the research. She found that somehow there's this connection between growing economic power amongst Black people and then their lynching, the fact that they're lynched. Okay? So I think Ida B. Wells is first. Du Bois refines, in a sense, the clues Ida B. Wells gives him. And at the turn of the century, they are conjoined to confront Booker T. Washington, who is the head Negro in charge at the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century, meaning that he is Master's boy on the plantation. That came out very well in the film last week. That is, that Booker T. Washington had the authority to pick and choose who would, be represented in certain federal positions. He was the federal government and corporate interests' favorite Negro to manage the race. This is at the turn of the century. Okay. He represents accommodationism because the whole notion of lift yourself up by your bootstraps, right? That Blacks should stay in their place so as not to scare white people. All of that comes with Booker T. Washington. Go slow, no revolution, don't ask for equality right now. Let's not burden people with things they can't handle. Okay. So I think that's really important to see Booker T. Washington as the 19th century or 19th, 20th, turn of the century, head Negro in charge, who is, confronted by these other people who want more, namely Ida B. Wells, under-recognized by her partner, Du Bois. Right? You got that?
Did Washington always
No, he was living with, he founded this Tuskegee Institute. Don't forget. That's in the South. Okay, so, and it's in here. She talks about the Tuskegee Institute, but his base is the South. That's where his base was. In agricultural, and Tuskegee Institute also does a lot of, agricultural research. To this day it does. And so I think that's really very interesting, this issue that you raised, though, Tom. The relationship between, quote unquote, the North and the South in terms of positioning leadership after the Civil War. That's an interesting question that we can think more about, later. So, here we come to the end of the 20th century, and we've still got the head Negro in charge itis. Now, what does that mean in political terms? Because it's not just a plantation epithet. It means something very specific. It means that what the implications are that there is one, maybe at the most 10, black people who get quoted in the newspaper, get consulted on who should get appointments, whose opinions count because they represent the race, quote unquote. Okay? The head Negro in charge-itis means then that there is basically one monolithic core of leadership and or representation. It also means then that people who do not have this position, their views, their reality, their experience, their interpretation of their own lives never get in the mainstream. Now, I know a lot of you think that, for example, rap and hip-hop culture is misogynist. It's got a lot of problems. However, and I don't know if it was Trisha Rose who says this in her book, I think she says it in her book, Black Noise, that rap is the first discourse, representation, analysis, critique that goes directly from a constituent group in the black community to the mainstream without the filtering of the head Negro in charge. Or anybody else, the head white folks in charge either. It goes straight from a specific community of production to a sector of the mainstream, or to a so-called market, however you want to define it, without a filter. And that's part of the problem, because people were just stunned, oh my God, they believe those things? Did you hear? People listening to rap or hip-hop, because this filtering, part of the HNIC-itis is a filtering process. You don't say things that folks can't handle. There's a control factor here. You never reproduce any kind of discourse or you never say anything that is going to really horrify, frighten, or otherwise disturb whites. Okay, which is why a lot of times whites are so shocked when they get into very frank, open discussions where they hear black people talking, because they've been exposed to a culture, a national narrative that kind of has all these various screens of protection, so that no one even knows what people really feel or believe until there's some accident happens. And for all practical purposes, rap is that accident. It's the only kind of demographic subgroup that has this direct channel to the mainstream from the black community. That's a very interesting phenomenon, and I just wanted to point that out. That was one of the points that Tricia Rose mentioned.
I wonder though, I mean, I've kind of noticed, I'm sorry, that rap is changing yet again though. Like, we saw this rise of, like, whatever, gangster rap, and like a lot of hardcore rap 5 years ago, and now I feel like it's sort of changing back to like this sort of hip hop, like everyone's happy, and you don't hear a lot about it, a lot of the underground.
A lot of the politics. We'll get there.
Okay.
You're right, because that's the issue of the market.
Yeah.
That's the issue of the market, and we'll get there when we read Angela Davis.
Okay.
Okay? Okay. So, HNICitis also is very, very controlled gender-wise. And this is one of the ways in which, black women have been silenced. It's that the people who have been these voices have been men. So, James brings out the whole issue of, how even progressive people, they took their ideas even and didn't even acknowledge them, right? And that's like Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells' ideas, or Du Bois wasn't always honest because of his own sexism. Even as he tried to do the revolutionary in terms of the master narrative of the United States as a whole at the turn of the century, he's raising the issue of women. Still, he does not come close to what we would consider in 1998 to be representing a feminist analysis, right? Or a black feminist analysis. So, or at least giving space. We would just never say an anonymous woman, as one woman says, without giving her name, right? And nobody would ever do that today. Okay. Now, what is happening is that, and what this article represents, in a way, is that Gates is positioning himself. Henry Louis Gates. Who's Henry Louis Gates? You're going to know a lot tomorrow. But Henry Louis Gates, and also this article, if someone's interested in getting a copy of this, the whole thing, we can make copies. To put in the, maybe what I'll do is we can make 3 copies just to put in those, our 3 reference things in the library that we have, so that you can make your own copies. Henry Louis Gates has his own working class identity notwithstanding, is positioning himself, or has positioned himself to be the prime representative of black people in the United States. He just bought a house, according to this magazine, next door to Julia Child and Henry Kissinger or whatever, for $890,000 in Boston. And he is being somewhat dishonest. And I have to say this very openly. The Gates, to me, is like Alice Walker. People who I saw as word warriors. I loved reading them, especially their nonfiction. It was so empowering to read people who somehow managed to represent the Black experience in such a way that they could express my anger that I couldn't articulate. It was somewhere down in here. And then they found ways that were very creative to somehow represent it. And I think a lot of people felt that. But for me, at this point in my life, those are two of the most disappointing scholars in the Black community, Alice Walker and Henry Louis Gates. And Gates's work now, he has appropriated, not only has he appropriated the Du Bois legacy by being hired at Harvard, and the institute that he is creating is called the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute of Black Studies, whatever. So it's natural to think that someone who knows the most about Du Bois is at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute of Black Studies. But he's choosing which part of Du Bois he wants to recognize. And the part of Du Bois that wrote that Black Reconstruction, that labor history of the United States, the first serious labor history of the United States, the Du Bois that goes towards the left as he gets more and more tied to decolonization and identifying with people who do the dirty work in society, that Du Bois is somehow lost on Gates. And interestingly, here comes race in an interesting way. The one who actually took all of Du Bois's work and put them together in an encyclopedia of several volumes is this, like he's still alive, but he's got to be 90-something. Herbert Aptheker, this Jewish American communist who lives in Berkeley, and she cites Bettina Aptheker. There's an Aptheker that Joy James cites in here. Bettina is the daughter of Herbert Aptheker, right? Herbert Aptheker, of course, positioned Du Bois as one of these incredible left thinkers and pioneers. And Gates, that is when he did his, there's something like, I can't remember how many volumes, at least 10 volumes of the Du Bois complete works that he edited and put together. And she cites them and please read your notes. The notes are really important in this book. Let me see, Aptheker. It's only got one Aptheker. But in your notes it says, on page 194, you see he has note 11, the talented 10th Memorial Address, writings by W.E.B. Du Bois and periodicals edited by others, volume 4. So, edited by Herbert Aptheker, 1982. So roughly around in the 1980s, Aptheker was putting together all of Du Bois's works. But his cultural evolution as a thinker, moving away from that talented 10th notion, has been ignored by Gates, who sees himself as leading this pack of elite scholars. It took him a year. Okay, so he's hired, and this article is all about, of course, it's very Boston-oriented, and therefore it talks about how Harvard pulls away Gates from Duke and how then, and gives him, all of these goodies that go along with getting to Harvard, founding an institute, gives him the right to bring these people that he wants to bring with him. And this is the whole story of who he brings. And it took a year to bring Cornel West. It took 2 years to get William Junius Wilson to leave the University of Chicago. So he's putting together this very potent think tank to represent this, to be this talented 10th positioned at Harvard. Okay? So it's just really very interesting. Manning Marable, who Joy James speaks very highly of, on the other hand, Manning Marable, who is at Columbia University, and Columbia University hired Manning Marable to do pretty much what Harvard hired Gates to do, which was to do a Black Studies Institute. And so there's an African American Studies Institute at Columbia that was just started around 3 or 4 years ago. Marable, however, is more on the left, and he's best known for a book called How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. He was very criticized for that book because people said he was ripping off from this Guyanan writer, Walter Rodney, who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. See, he took How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and he decided to take that paradigm to look at Black America, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. That's Manning Marable. He's always had a kind of pro-labor position, Manning Marable. And when Columbia University, 2 years ago, last October, that is 1996, in October, they had a conference that was seen as just major, where Black intellectuals, where labor people and academics were supposed to get together to give this new analysis of what on earth is going on in the United States. A linkage that was supposed to be really important of academics, intellectuals, and labor. But classic as it is to New York, all of the people from labor were kind of the typical classic white left. There was this little spot for Black people, and so Manning Marable and the person who I don't think she was his wife at the time, Leith Mullings, whom you were going to read soon also, on our own terms. They've just been married like 2 or 3 years, so I get that mixed up. But in any event, they pulled out, along with Robin Kelly of NYU, they pulled out of that conference, labor and academics, because it was so fraught with racism, with the classic problem, which I think is very Northeast. It's not as heavy in the West as it is in the Northeast, of leftists, speaking for Black. Okay? All right, because this is very interesting, because it brings me to the conference now that I attended this weekend. So, Manning Marable and his wife Leith, and Bill Fletcher, who is the education director of the AFL-CIO. Now, in its new thrust, this is a new paragraph, let me go digress here and tell you that the AFL-CIO for years has been on what I would consider a steady wrong path. Okay? Steady wrong path. In that it backed up U.S. foreign policy positions, which in support of colonial policy, wherever it was, in support of the neo-colonial policies, in support of the wealthy people in Nicaragua, wherever it was, the AFL-CIO did not support the least prestigious group in that society, right? It didn't, in other words, confront right here at home the United States foreign policy objective, which was, let's keep all these brown and whatever folks, dominated folks, under control here, wherever, so that business can proceed and grow the way it did. Foreign policy. Are you with me so far? You following me? Okay. So the AFL, so Bill Fletcher, Leith Mullings, an anthropologist, feminist anthropologist, and Manning Marable, who was hired by Columbia. Let's see, who else? Someone, Abdul Al-Kalimat, who changed his name. I can't remember what his name was before, but he was a professor on the left, very labor-oriented from Ohio. Four, there were five. Decided that what they had to do was to organize a black radical Congress that would have several principles, the most important being the whole issue of labor, you know, working with labor, or that, you know, supporting people who were trying to understand what is happening to working people, especially black working people in the United States in 1998. Okay? So, after they had their first preliminary meeting, okay, so in May 3rd to 4th, 1997, that group votes to draft a declaration document to be used for discussion purposes in the building of a Black Radical Congress. Later on that year, they do a draft declaration, and in the fall, they put together a document that is now called the Black Freedom Agenda for the 21st century. And some of this I'm not going to be able to read to you because it's still considered quote-unquote private, but this is sort of history. And then, and there are meetings, and I go to one, I can't remember, I went to one in Chicago last year, the first one. And I got a little bit disgruntled because I went as an affiliate, or kind of working with, or as a representative of, the Northwest Labor and Employment Law Office in Seattle, which I have to describe so that you'll understand some of the issues and how they relate to this. Okay, so that it's also called LILO. Grenadell's sister has been sort of drafted into LILO because she attended one of the conferences that we tried to organize. But this was a group that roughly includes Blacks, Asians, and Latinos. And one of the central underpinnings of all three of these constituent groups was that the local and the international had to be connected. They were not, you know, for working people, they were not separate, okay, they under any circumstances. So that how these three groups, as opposed to other three groups, got together was basically almost happenstance. One, that some, on one hand, in terms of black people, some black veterans wanted to get into the construction industry, which across this country has been locked and closed to minorities. The construction industry is one of the most racist. And so they decided that they wanted to open up the construction industry. There was one Chinese guy in this group of mostly black vets, Chinese American. And they, you know, closed bridges, camped out on construction sites until you hire minorities. You're not building anything here. I mean, one of those 1970s kind of thing. And that's why Seattle is one of the few places that in 1998 has pipe fitters who belong to the unions and plumbers and electricians and carpenters working on construction sites who are minority because of that kind of action in 1990. This group of black construction workers also decided something else in the 80s. They didn't go along with constructive engagement with South African apartheid. And they wanted to support Southern African liberation struggles, and they went to Mozambique. And that's how I first heard about them when I was still living in New York. It was a white South African feminist who has written several interesting books, including And Still They Dance, which is about the role of women in Mozambican liberation movement. Her name is Stephanie Erdang, U-R-D-A-N-G. And when I interviewed Stephanie on a radio program that I had, Women in the World in 1980, she told me about these men who were, mostly men, construction workers who went to Mozambique. They built wells, they helped build schools, and they said to Ronald Reagan's policies, working people have a right to have a foreign policy too. Working people, not just elites, working people should have a foreign policy, have a right to a foreign policy. Very important point. Okay. At about this time, there's another group that's very interesting, which of Asian, mostly Asian, but some Native American, but mostly Filipino, Asian fish cannery workers in Alaska, right? And there are several big Supreme Court decisions that relate to the work of this group and the founders of this group, like Ward's Cove versus Antonio, and so on. In any event, two of the Filipino activists in Alaska were also connected to worrying about what happened in the Philippines and were anti-Marcos people. They were blown away by Marcos agents in the middle of Seattle about 11 or 12 years ago, assassinated, boom, point blank. And by this time, these three groups have gotten together. The farm workers, Latino farm workers, who were also opposed to the Central American policy of Ronald Reagan, and these Filipinos and these black workers. So that the two of the founders of this organization being killed by Marcos agents, the case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, the first time in the history of the United States that somebody took a case and said you do not have to write that a government is responsible for ordering the killing of people on U.S. soil, right? That they can't do that. And the estates of Marcos they had to pay millions. I can't remember how many. It wasn't a lot of money. It seemed like a lot, but it's gone. It's just virtually gone. But so Lilo was involved in pushing that all the way to the Supreme Court. So, like, again, local issues and international issues are not separated. They are together. That was central. That's been a central issue of Lilo from the beginning. So now, in representing this group, right, mostly workers, rank and file workers, not labor bureaucrats, there's a distinction between a labor bureaucrat and somebody who goes up on the crane at night on a 12 to 8 shift, right? We're talking about people who are regular rank and file workers. And I'm one of the few academics, well, the only academic. There's some other bureaucrats who are in Lilo. But this is who I'm representing when I go to this meeting. So, you know, I have that's the hat I'm wearing. And I know I became, at least this weekend, but also in the first meeting to some degree, but not as much as this weekend, the guest you really don't want to invite back for the second weekend. You know, because I was just a pain in the whatever. Because I felt that, and I sort of got disgruntled and said, oh, do I really want to go to these meetings and argue this over and over and over again? And what was I arguing? that academics have a lot to learn from, that is intellectuals have a lot to learn from workers, rank and file workers, who understand a lot more about their situation than they are given credit for. What we have to do is to be aware that we cannot speak for average, ordinary working people, whether it's our parents or grandparents or whatever, as we get our degrees, right? And this has been one of the hardest things for people to talk about. That's one of the central issues brought up also in in the book as well. But I think we made a great headway because in terms of this week. And I want to read some of the, let's see. And then I have to talk about the black feminists. So you see, there was, it's not just that there was this issue over worker, but there's also this issue over the role of women that became very contentious. And at this meeting, there was a caucus of feminists. And continually, there's this struggle. Which are you first? Are you black first? Are you a woman first? And that got even more refined. Are you youth first? Are you a feminist first? And then that got even, you see there, all these layers of how do you choose your major or your primary constituency? Is there no such thing as a young worker who's feminist or a radical feminist or whatever? You see what I'm saying? So it gets really, it gets really complicated in trying to organize around these types of issues. So people had documents like a glossary of black radical feminist terms and concepts that they wanted to get the group to recognize. A lot of men who were very sensitive now, because people have been jumping up and down and screaming about the issues of feminism, still didn't realize that there were women who didn't speak, but that there were men who spoke more than twice. Or when they spoke only once, they gave sermons as opposed to just raising questions. You know what I mean? So it's just like really very interesting. So I had a document that was supposed to be my framework for discussion that I had taken from Lilo, where basically we said the most important thing is that foreign policy is a working class issue, and that also this question of black nationalism or whatever had to be responded to by making it more international. But then the question then becomes, does an integrated group that has non-black people in it also get to participate in, being a part of the central organizing of this group? These are all unresolved issues that I'm sharing with you, and that hopefully in the meeting in June, this was the last planning meeting over the program that was to take place, and that's why it was so important that I attend. So, but I think because the New York Times has already pitted Gates and Manning Marable. Remember the article that I mentioned in the New York Times? These are two streams. There's a talented 10th, that is a group of elites who can represent, black people, or there are people who want to, include labor. And so here's this sentence. I'll just read this one. The task of the Black Radical Congress folks is to take back the voice of the black intellectual from those who see their position as part of a new talented 10th. Even those who deny this perspective sometimes unwittingly advance ideas that promote this concept. In appropriating his or her own voice, the black radical, in other words, by getting it back from the elitists. The black radical intellectual must guard against consuming the voice of black working men and women. If not, this will lead to simultaneously downplaying the historical task of the working class while inventing a fictitious transformational task for the middle class. And that was really interesting in terms of how I was really pleased to see how she even addresses this question of the middle class, and it's how people are trying to position the middle class as having this leadership role. Let me see what else I can tell you about this. Well, someone also came with a document, someone from the Caribbean came with a document that was really very interesting, a document that with warnings to this conference that's going to take place June 19th to 21st in Chicago. And his thing was, quote, "The most important new development in the debate is the centrality of the place of the black woman in the struggle for social transformation. This discussion emanates from a long tradition of struggle by black women and the determination that the black woman should never again be marginalized in a radical formation." For those of you who have studied the 60s, know that the black woman was extremely marginalized. Anyway, it says, "The ensuing debates on gender and social reproduction holds the seeds of the most profound understanding of the limits of the concentration on productive forces that was the hallmark of radical politics in the generation after 1917. Now, the reason why this was interesting was, that's such an interesting idea, and he was somebody who supported my position, and this is something that we all have to work through, is that if we're serious about wanting this to be broad-based and having working people share in the leadership position, then we've got to be willing to give up this language. See what I mean? So again, it's something that we all have to think about, the burdens of the past coming to sit down on the shoulders of the living. This language is just, it's out of the range. And by putting the documents in this language, it tells people, yes, we are interested in working people, but, this is beyond your ken. Because if you can't really do this, this stuff, this writing for college, then you can't participate, right? And so that has to be really interrogated. And that's hard because, as all of you I know, as you struggle to create new kinds of ways to write, as do I, this is a real issue. What is the most accessible way for me to describe this experience? It's a real issue, especially for those of us who go on to graduate school where the language gets ever more, beyond, right? Now, another point that was very interesting. So one of the people brought a statement by someone who is mentioned also in this book, Assata. So I think that was really interesting to get, and I didn't dare read this on the plane. With the people, now that they have those airplanes so small that someone's elbow is in your chin, and your elbow is in his or her ribs. I couldn't believe this. And this latest plane was the smallest I'd ever been on. It's like you don't have any privacy. So I said, oh no, we're waiting until we get home to read this one because of who she is. How many of you have heard of Assata? Someone want to say who she is?
She was a black revolutionary in New York in the late 70s, and she was with a couple other people, and she tried running with the police, and she got accused. I don't know exactly, like somebody pulled out a gun, and basically she got shot in the back and taken to prison, and somehow she managed to escape. She's in exile in Cuba, and the United States makes attempts from time to time to try to have her come back, because put back in prison in the United States. She's given a lot of speeches and written stuff since then in exile from Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Probably she's most known by being Tupac's aunt.
Yeah.
Tupac Shakur's aunt. Okay. Assata Shakur. I can't read this whole thing, but I'm gonna have it typed and not typed, reproduced to put in our thing also. But I'm gonna read part of it because I think it's very interesting in terms of what this book also talks about, the role of the FBI in confronting the state in terms of people who say, I don't, that there is injustice and I don't, as Malcolm X said, by any means necessary, injustice should end. And the minute you say something like that, oh my God, guns, radicals, militants, horror, horror, horror. And so in the 70s, with the Black Panther Party and so on, I mean, the FBI's COINTELPRO program, now everybody knows that counterintelligence program, i.e. COINTELPRO, infiltrated organizations, sent out lies. We now know, and it's public record that they sent letters to Martin Luther King with copies of the tapes that they had of him in various and sundry situations that were embarrassing. Kill yourself or we're going to give these tapes to your wife and then the press. I mean, just disgusting stuff. I mean, that the government could be involved in this kind of low-life stuff. And J. Edgar Hoover was probably the lowest of the low-life public officials that we've ever had. So this is really interesting. I found it interesting, and there was a book that this woman wrote, Assata, Autobiography of a Revolutionary. It was published, but it kind of is real hard to get. So, it's practically one of those books that you feel, since the government was trying to do this, which was take down the names of anybody who asks for certain books, that they were trying to do that kind of stuff. And this is the kind of book that you should not ask for on interlibrary loan. So don't say I didn't warn you. My name is Assata Shakur, and I'm a 20th century escaped slave. Because of government persecution, I was left with no other choice than to flee from the political repression, racism, and violence that dominate the U.S. government's policy towards people of color. I am an ex-political prisoner. I've been living in exile in Cuba since 1984. And she signs, and then she signs it with kind of like a cheer, free all political prisoners. I send you love and revolutionary greetings from Cuba, one of the largest, most resistant, and most courageous palenques, or fugitive slave camps. A palenque was an old 19th century term in Cuba for a runaway slave community. One of the largest, most resistant, most courageous palenques that has ever existed on the face of this planet. Now, I thought that was interesting. That is how she's defining Cuba, which is true. It's a country that is at least, half black. That doesn't come out too often, but which has its own unresolved contradictions about race. And yet, that is an interesting definition. And then she describes her case. She's telling, you can tell she typed it herself. It has a few typos and things. But she explains this whole thing in such a way that you could check it up for yourself. Is this true? And apparently Governor Christine Whitman has raised the reward for her capture. That is, has increased it. I think that's what she means. And that she's afraid that bounty hunters are going to try to get her if the reward gets really high. People, mercenaries. And she says that, she recognizes that they're slave catchers and that these mercenaries have these new names in the 20th century, but she sees it as slave catchers. And she's apparently someone wanted to do an interview with her, and she said that she would do one on NBC, and then she saw the program and said that there were all these distortions, and this is a document to clarify the distortions. So this is also going to be copied for people who want to see it. It'll be in the library in one of the 3 books if you want to read it. Now, I think what's interesting in the evolution of this Black Radical Congress, and still the unresolved contradiction, which is the role of labor, and I was, my whole time, there were all these different sectors who had their articles and things that were very interesting. We all had our constituent groups that we were representing with documents to hand out. But the most interesting unresolved question was, is labor going to be merely another constituent group, like youth, like women, like lesbians and gays, like whatever, Black Christians, or is it going to be central to the entire thing? That is we still don't know, and I think that's one of the issues that is very interesting. I know I'm going to see Joy there, how she sees that. And if one doesn't really have to, be in a situation where you have to wear the hat or the hard hat of workers, a lot of stuff goes right by you. So that she organized which was the first really good conference on prison labor in March at Boulder, Colorado. Not prison labor, the problem of the increasing prisons. But almost all of the speakers even were people who did this work as academics or lawyers. And I thought, now, what would have made that better? How could the prison population have been brought to bear more directly into, or ex-prisoners? I'm not sure, but I think it's necessary to try. And the one person who was supposed to come, who had spent some time as a political prisoner, wasn't able to go to that conference that she organized. So, coming to conclude this so that we can have time for questions, I also want to talk about what is happening in Seattle. So that Lilo was also involved in at least talking with people who are very concerned at the new Kingdom. I know if you've been reading the newspapers and hearing the news reports, you know about what is happening at the Kingdom. And at Friday, all these people walked out. Now, one of the points in this talk, or in this paper that I had, was that Black people could not just conceive of themselves as leaders of Black people, that we had to see our struggles being the same of not just all of the minorities, but also poor whites as well. And so we've been functioning that way. And one of the interesting examples of this is this thing with this new stadium, where there's been a lot of horrible things happening. And but in the speeches that were written and presented on Friday at this meeting of about 500 workers, most of whom are white, the first guy, the opening speech, was Native American. Fellow workers, thank you for attending this meeting today. My name is Wayne, and I'm a cement mason. And he talked about what is happening to not just women, but the people of color, because there's a company that is handling the workers there who have allowed some really terrible things to happen on the job. And so they were complaining about that, and they were also complaining about health and safety. And this woman is African American. My name is Monica, and I'm an electrician with Valley Electric, and safety is a key concern for this meeting. And then she talked about safety issues that are being overlooked, right? Then there were two white men who spoke. Hi, my name is Ralph, and I'm a carpenter. And he spoke to the racial issue. The guy who was white, right? And I think that there was an Asian American guy who was a carpenter who spoke about this hate crimes that have been happening on the job. And then the last speaker who gave the demands was white. And the demands, which were on the radio, so you must have heard them already. We demand that HK, which is this company, create a clear-cut written no fighting policy and distribute it to all workers on the job. We demand that HK start enforcing a zero-tolerance policy for racism and sexism, and so on. So it's really, this is an interesting time, and I think the Joy James book has let me see, there was something I wanted to refer to in here. Roman 13. About the, first world knowledge production commodity. This is what she's saying, that knowledge cannot be that. And it reminds me of what this Somali linguist said, on page Roman 13, where she says race is big business, a major first world knowledge producing commodity. The struggle against racism, on the other hand, is not. Race is, but racism is not. That the whole question of we must separate knowledge from language and content from its form. And I thought, I heard that 20 years ago by a linguist friend from Somalia, East Africa. He said when Somalia was getting independence, that those of us who had grown up in British Somaliland went to Britain to study, and those of us who had grown up in Italian Somaliland went to Italy to study. But when we got independence, some of us would send memos to the others in English, and we'd get answers back in Italian. But everybody spoke Somali. And so the government decided, and all of the Somali people, that we had to make Somali a written language so that we could separate knowledge from language and content from its form. And I thought, that is the battle for intellectuals in conjunction with workers today, to separate knowledge from language and content from its form.
Who said that?
Hussein Adam. His Xuseen Adam was this linguist who said that. But it just occurred to me that is the task of the American, not just the Black American, but the American intellectual. If in fact, the country is not to increase this mushrooming thing where all of the wealth continues to be concentrated in ever fewer hands, and that the safety net just continues to blow out for working people. And I think that I'll stop there. Separate knowledge from language and content from its form. Okay. Okay, so what is knowledge? What we learn, what we think of as information that we need to have in order to build and create new information, right? And that knowledge that information should not be tied to a specific language, English, right? Nor should it be tied to a specific discourse, i.e. academies. We have to separate the content, that is the juice of what we think, content, from the form it comes in. Not books with small print. There's a whole concept that literacy workers talk about, dense print, that workers don't command dense print because they don't have to, whereas intellectuals, quote unquote, or academics, we work with books, dense print, all the time. It doesn't frighten us. But if we're serious about working together with working people, we've got to use a form that moves beyond dense print.
So that's like a message to intellectuals as opposed to...
I think it's a message for everybody. Bro, that knowledge has to be separated from language or discourse, and the content, the juice of our collective thoughts that can move us forward must be separated from the form it comes in. I mean, we've got to be able to make it more accessible, especially because our whole society is dumbing down. There are people who aren't used to reading even because, of getting the news or anything, any information about anything from books. And I'm not saying throw away books, but I'm saying that we've got to separate knowledge from language and content. Oh, yes. I think we do. For one thing, we will never, as intellectuals, those of us who see ourselves as academic or intellectuals or whatever, poets, people who work with the word, we will not be open to hearing knowledge from in other forms and learning from other people if we don't do that. So in that same lecture that this Somali linguist was saying this, he wasn't thinking about workers at all. I'm just saying that now, today, that this is where I've come. But when he was saying that, he was talking about how the Somali people were an oral people, and that one of the common things that they would do is to create on the spot poetry, just and a kind of contest using a consonant where the beginning of each line is the same consonant. And I'm going, my mind boggles at the thought of somebody being able to do that. I couldn't do that if my life depended on it. I could not do that. And it's possible that some rappers could, but I know I could not do that. And I'm just thinking of the different ways in my life that I have learned things that have pushed me forward, and they have never been the most important things. Have been in the form that we assume knowledge to come in. They've been in unusual situations, experiences, said by people in the unexpected moments. So I'm just saying that if we're serious about learning from working class people, we have to be ready to hear knowledge and to recognize it and understand it in the different forms that it is presented to us.
Can we broaden that to say if we want to learn from anybody? Because working class is one class, there are lots of other classes below that in our society that also don't get acknowledged and also don't get heard.
Just in response to what you were saying, let me go back to my little document that I took with me to say, Rashid, you bring up a very good point, and that one of the issues that we said is that we have to just expand the definition of working class to include not just organized workers. Oh God, I don't have it. not just organized workers, but what and who is the labor movement in this historical period? How do we expand the definition of worker to include prison labor, welfare recipients, long-term unemployed, and the unorganized workers? And I think it's been really a problem of the labor movement. That's one of the whole issues of AFL-CIO-itis, that if you're not recognized formally by this organization, you cannot call yourself technically a worker or part of the labor movement. Not.
That label still does not acknowledge the homeless and the
True.
people who live in the woods, who have some really powerful things to say about our society today. It still leaves them unaccounted for and unacknowledged in the knowledge base. And what I'm saying is, if we're going to work in this group to broaden those definitions, let's really open it up. Let's go there.
That's really important. I agree with you.
Because labor, if we go with your definition of the labor movement, we're still leaving those folks out. And I think we need to not do that.
Yeah, well, I would see long-term unemployed, though, there. I mean,
Yes and no.
you know.
I'm a long-term unemployed person, okay? And I'm a college student. I'm lucky.
Yeah, but
I'm
then,
not living out in the woods in Aberdeen, okay? There's a bunch of them that are.
but there are also homeless students who are college
Oh,
students, too.
I know that.
So, I mean, it's very complicated. And yet, when you put this on a global level, even the options to United States homeless are different from being homeless in Thailand or someplace else. So, but I agree with you, Rashid, definitely. That knowledge comes from, that there are all these avenues in which we have to, certainly, the experts on homelessness should definitely not just be homed people. Questions, comments?
Well, I can't resolve this whole thing about language with the book that we read. And it's just driving me crazy, like, because I felt like she was critiquing these people for being elitist and, like, kind of really sympathizing or really looking at the work that people like Angela Davis and Minnie Marable and Bernice Johnson-Regan had done as, you know, connected and inclusive of, like, working people and other people. And then the language that she was using in the book, I mean, like, I've been studying social sciences, like, really, really hardcore for, like, 6 years, and I had a hard time with the book, so, I don't know. I mean, I think the points that she raised, a lot of the points she raised in the book were really great, but I kept wondering if it was a joke, like, through the book, like, is this a joke? I can't understand why she's being so incredibly, like, elitist in her language as she's critiquing the elitism of academics, and so, I was wondering if you had some ideas about that.
I think maybe she is probably also trying to direct it to academics who are writing that language. Because they kind of maybe deconstruct their academia, because maybe they won't even recognize her. Like if she was trying to make it more accessible.
Like the Jefferson Hotel was done in a certain way.
Yeah, I think that's her intended audience. Maybe intellectuals and maybe there should have been 2 versions.
But I think translated.
What did you say?
I said there should have been 2 versions.
Well, I mean, and it's true because, I mean, any person that's an intellectual that actually is in working class or poor communities has this job of like a translator, you know? And it's like, sometimes it's difficult to take a book like this and then like act as a translator and try to take the ideas or like, you know, separate, content and form and try to get the content without speaking the language or the...
See, you can answer the question for yourself, Erica, if you just play this out. You play this out. and contextualize it. Keeping in mind the politics of citation, that some folks' jobs are dependent upon how many times they are cited by other academics, and that that's a real problem with all intellectuals who are a minority, is that they do not get cited. Now, this is in anthropology, but in anthropology it is so bizarre that you can even write a book about a certain subject and you are so ignored that someone can come along and later use your ideas and write about the same thing and not only not cite you, but reproduce what you wrote, and then they are recognized as the expert or the person who's invented this new way of looking at whatever it is. You see what I mean? So it's where is she working? I mean, she's in a university environment. And she does not have tenure. And affirmative action is going really fast in certain places like Colorado. I mean, I don't know. I'm going to call her tonight because I thought it would be interesting after our seminar this afternoon to share some of the ideas with her and see if she gets any response to it on Thursday. I can bring them back. But I know that this is a real issue. How do you write for multiple audiences? And that is never recognized as an issue for anybody except minority scholars. And the reason why it's an issue for them is that they want to write at least on subjects that will help to explicate some aspect of life, you know, in U.S. society. But that's a real problem.